Absolute obedience is not a virtue. It is a control technology that turns human will into malleable clay, individual consciousness into a disposable instrument, and autonomy into a sin that must be exercised with the same urgency as a tumor is removed. When an institution asks you to relinquish your capacity for judgment, it is not asking you to trust. It is asking you to remove the last barrier between yourself and its will, to surrender the very mechanism that allows you to recognize when you are being exploited. The convents of the Catholic world perfected this technology over centuries, refining it until it became such an elegant system that its victims often defended their own oppression with the fervor of those protecting something sacred. This was no accident. It was deliberate psychological architecture, built on an intuitive understanding of how to dismantle a human personality and rebuild it as a perfectly submissive instrument. The vow of obedience, one of the three fundamental vows of religious life, along with poverty and chastity, is presented as an act of humility, a renunciation of the ego in favor of something greater. The official narrative is seductive in its simplicity. By renouncing your individual will, you free yourself from the burdens of selfishness and join a purer collective will, closer to the divine. But this narrative conceals a much darker mechanic. What really happens when someone takes the vow of obedience is that they transfer the locus of moral control from their own conscience to an external authority. Every decision, from the most trivial to the most fundamental, ceases to be evaluated by your own ethical framework and is judged solely by its conformity to the will of your superiors. You are not freeing yourself from the ego. You are systematically training your mind to ignore internal signals that would tell you when something is wrong, when you are being manipulated, when your dignity is being violated. The architects of this system understood something that modern psychology would confirm centuries later. Human identity is not a fixed essence. It is a continuous process of construction that critically depends on autonomy. When you make decisions, even small ones, you reinforce the feeling that you are an agent with control over your life. When you are repeatedly denied the capacity to make decisions, something fundamental begins to erode. It is not just that you become obedient. It is that you begin to lose the ability to imagine disobedience as a real possibility. Your mind adapts to the absence of agency in the same way that eyes adapt to darkness, reconfiguring their basic expectations about what is possible. In traditional convents, this erosion was systematic and began from the first day. Novices were subjected to a regimen where practically every aspect of their existence was controlled. When to wake up, what to eat, when to speak, when to be silent, how to dress, how to walk, how to hold their hands during prayer. Each of these rules, taken individually, might seem trivial, but cumulatively, they created an environment where autonomy was impossible, where every moment of the day was an opportunity to practice submission. The brilliant and terrible thing about this design is that it used the novice's own psychology against her. At first, most women who entered a convent experienced internal resistance. Something within them rebelled against the total loss of control, against the denial of their own judgments and desires. But this resistance was precisely what the system was designed to destroy. Every impulse of autonomy was reframed not as a healthy sign of an intact psyche, but as evidence of spiritual pride, of an ego that had not yet been sufficiently humiliated. The novice quickly learned that expressing doubts or resistance did not lead to dialogue or genuine consideration of her concerns. Instead, it led to an intensification of discipline, additional penances, reminders that her inability to obey happily was a moral flaw that required correction. This dynamic created a perfect psychological trap. If you obeyed without resistance, you were virtuous. If you resisted, it only proved that you needed more discipline, more humiliation, more destruction of your individual will. Santa Teresa of Avila, one of the most revered figures in the Catholic tradition and reformer of Carmel, provided the intellectual framework for this system with a clarity that is as fascinating as it is disturbing. In her writings on obedience, Teresa did not beat around the bush about what she was asking for. She wrote that the perfectly obedient nun should be like a corpse that can be moved from one place to another without resistance, like a tool that has no will of its own regarding how it is used. This was not a metaphor meant to be gently interpreted. Teresa was literally describing the annihilation of the self as the highest spiritual ideal. And here is the truly unsettling part. She herself had gone through this process, had been shaped by these same techniques, and instead of recognizing the psychological trauma inherent in this system, she had internalized it so completely that she dedicated her life to perfecting and exporting it. Teresa is the perfect example of how systemic psychological abuse not only destroys individuals, but also turns them into evangelists of their own destruction. Santa Teresa's case also illustrates how the system perpetuated itself through generations. The women who survived the process of psychological dismantling and emerged as figures of authority within the convent were not necessarily sadistic or malicious. They were, in many cases, true believers who had been so completely reformatted by the system that they genuinely believed they were doing spiritual good by subjecting new generations to the same process. They had learned to interpret their own psychological annihilation as spiritual enlightenment, their loss of autonomy as freedom, their inability to trust their own judgment as humility. And from that distorted perspective, inflicting the same process on others was an act of love, spiritual guidance, salvation. This is the most effective form of social control. When the victims of the system become its most zealous guardians, when they defend their own oppression with more fervor than the original oppressors. But the vow of obedience did not operate in a vacuum. Its effectiveness depended on its interaction with the other two vows, particularly the vow of poverty. By renouncing any personal possessions, the nuns became completely dependent on the institution for every material need. They had no own money, no property, no resources they could use to escape if they decided the system was intolerable. This material dependence reinforced the psychological dependence created by the vow of obedience. Even if a nun began to question the system, even if her conscience started to rebel against what she was experiencing, the practical question became paralyzing. If I leave this, where do I go? How do I survive? Who am I outside of this structure that has defined every aspect of my existence for years or decades? This combination of material and psychological dependence created what modern psychologists would call a perfect capture situation. You don't need physical walls to keep people imprisoned when you've built the prisons inside their own minds. Chastity, the third vow, added another layer of psychological control. By prohibiting any expression of sexuality or even close physical affection, the system deprived the nuns of one of the most fundamental sources of human connection and emotional validation. Human beings are social animals who need contact, intimacy, and relationships where they can be vulnerable and authentic. By denying these needs under the banner of spiritual purity, the system created a chronic emotional void, and this void became another form of dependence. The only source of approval, validation, or any kind of emotional warmth came from the convent hierarchy. A word of praise from the superior, a gesture of maternal affection from a more veteran nun. These moments became disproportionately significant for someone who was chronically deprived of human connection. And thus the system created hunger and then offered itself as the only source of nourishment, ensuring that the nuns remained emotionally chained even when they intellectually questioned what they were experiencing. The documented cases of abuse within convents reveal how this system of total control could be exploited by individuals with power pathologies. When someone with sadistic or narcissistic tendencies assumed a position of authority in a convent, the vow of obedience became a license for unlimited psychological torture. There was no effective external oversight, no mechanism for nuns to report abuse without violating their vow of obedience, and no way to appeal to a higher authority without being accused of lacking humility. Abusive superiors could design humiliating penances, isolate specific nuns from the rest of the community, reinterpret every action through a lens of suspicion, and always find reasons to punish. And all of this was done under the guise of spiritual guidance, as if cruelty were medicine and humiliation were therapy. The Convent of the Sisters of Mary Magdalene in Ireland provides a particularly dark example of how this system could mutate into something openly monstrous. Although technically not all women in these institutions were nuns who had taken vows, The system operated with the same logic of absolute obedience. The women, many of whom were sent there by families who considered them morally problematic or simply inconvenient, were subjected to forced labor under brutal conditions. They washed clothes for commercial institutions without pay, working long hours in dangerous conditions. They were beaten, humiliated publicly, deprived of their real names, and rebaptized with numbers or names chosen by the nuns. Their heads were shaved. They were denied contact with the outside world. And all this happened within the framework of a religious institution, justified by the need to redeem these women from their supposed sins. The last of these convents did not close until 1996, a date so recent that it disarms any attempt to dismiss it as irrelevant ancient history. What makes the Magdalenas particularly revealing is not just the brutality of what happened there, but the fact that the system was able to operate for so long with the active complicity of the broader society. Families knew where they were sending their daughters. The church knew what was happening. The government knew. But the framework of religious obedience provided perfect cover. These women had been placed under the authority of the church, and questioning what the church did with them was questioning the social order itself. The vow of obedience, even when applied to women who had never done it voluntarily, created a zone of impunity where atrocities could be normalized as discipline, where abuse could be reframed as correction, where economic exploitation could be justified as redemptive work. But even in convents that did not reach these extremes of open abuse, the fundamental psychological dynamic remained problematic. The process of forming a nun, even in the most benign communities, involved a systematic dismantling of psychological autonomy. The techniques varied in their intensity and cruelty, but the ultimate goal was the same: to produce an individual who not only obeyed external orders, but had internalized the voice of authority so completely that obedience became automatic, unconscious, a second nature. This is the hallmark of successful psychological conditioning, when the victim no longer experiences obedience as forced submission, but as an authentic expression of their own will. When you have reached that point, when the system's voice has become indistinguishable from your own inner voice, then control is complete and almost impossible to undo. Modern psychology has extensively documented the effects of this type of environment on mental health. Studies on former nuns who left closed religious orders reveal high rates of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and deep difficulties in making independent decisions. Many described a process of leaving that took years or decades, not only in logistical terms, but psychological as well. They had to relearn how to trust their own judgment, how to distinguish between what they truly believed and what they had been conditioned to believe, how to make decisions without constantly seeking external approval. Some never fully succeeded. The system had reconfigured their brains at such a fundamental level that certain autonomy circuits never fully recovered. This is not a metaphor. Neuroplasticity means that repeated experiences literally reshape neural connections. Years of being punished for autonomy and rewarded for submission create neural patterns that persist long after the environment that created them has disappeared. And this is where the history of convents connects with broader patterns of psychological control in society. The vow of obedience in its extreme form may be rare, but the dynamic it represents is omnipresent. Any institution that demands unconditional obedience, punishes questioning, treats individual autonomy as a threat rather than a value, is operating from the same basic template. The employer who demands absolute loyalty and reinterprets any criticism as disloyalty. The political leader who demands that followers accept their word without verification and treats skepticism as treason. The family that uses guilt and moral obligation to suppress the individuality of its members. These are echoes of the same system, perhaps diluted versions, but built on the same psychological principles, creating dependence, eroding autonomy, punishing dissent, and reconfiguring the psyche until obedience feels like freedom. Convents provide us with a particularly clear case study because the system was explicit about its objectives. There was no ambiguity about the fact that the purpose was to destroy individual will. This was written in training manuals, preached in sermons, celebrated as the path to holiness. This transparency allows us to see the mechanics of psychological control without the layers of denial and rationalization that usually obscure similar systems in secular contexts. When a modern cult essentially does the same, when a toxic corporation demands the same kind of absolute loyalty, when a political movement requires the same suppression of critical judgment, the techniques are often identical but disguised under different language. Instead of talking about spiritual humility, they talk about being a team player. Instead of penances, they have disciplinary procedures. Instead of superiors, they have managers or charismatic leaders. But the underlying structure is the same. A system designed to produce unconditional obedience by systematically destroying the individual's ability to trust their own judgment. The common defense of these systems is that obedience is necessary for any functional organization, that you cannot have an effective army, a successful business, or a coherent religious community if everyone is constantly questioning every decision. And there is some truth to this. Social coordination requires a certain level of hierarchy and deference to authority. But there is a fundamental difference between functional obedience, which allows questioning and keeps individual judgment as a valuable resource, and totalitarian obedience, which treats questioning as a crime and individual judgment as a danger. Functional obedience says, follow these rules because they allow us to work together effectively. But if you see a genuine problem, you have a duty to point it out. Totalitarian obedience says, follow these rules because questioning them is evidence of your moral defect. And if you see a problem, the problem is you for seeing it. The convents operated almost universally under the totalitarian model, and the result was centuries of unnecessary suffering justified as a spiritual necessity. The legacy of this system continues to reverberate. Even the religious orders that have moderated their practices in recent decades operate under structures that still emphasize obedience as a central virtue. And the model of the convent has influenced countless other institutions. Religious boarding schools, seminaries, Catholic charitable institutions, all have imported aspects of this total control system. Techniques of suppressing autonomy, the systematic erosion of individual judgment, the creation of emotional and material dependence. These are not historical relics. They are living technologies that continue to be implemented wherever those in power have learned that absolute obedience is easier to achieve than you might think, as long as you are willing to devote enough systematic effort to dismantling the psychological defenses of your subjects. The final irony is that many women who entered convents did so seeking freedom. In societies where the options for women were marriage or the convent, many chose the convent precisely because it offered an alternative to patriarchal control by husbands and fathers. Some sought access to education, which convents offered when few other institutions did for women. Some sought an intellectual or spiritual life that secular society denied them. And some simply looked for a space where they could exist outside traditional roles of wife and mother. But what they found, in many cases, was not freedom, but a different and often more complete form of control. The patriarchy they had escaped in secular society was replicated and amplified within the walls of the convent, now with the additional power of religious authority. The pursuit of autonomy led them directly to a system designed to annihilate autonomy. This is no coincidence. The institutions that promise freedom in exchange for total obedience are almost always offering a fraudulent transaction. True freedom never requires renouncing your ability to judge, because that ability is precisely what allows you to recognize if you are truly free. The specific mechanisms of control in convents teach us something fundamental about human vulnerability. You don't need extreme physical violence to destroy a psyche. You don't need torture chambers. You only need enough control over a person's environment so that each day reinforces the lessons you want to teach. That autonomy is dangerous, that individual judgment is unreliable, that obedience is security, that submission is virtue. Given enough time and sufficient consistency, almost anyone can be reconfigured. Resistance is not a matter of willpower. It is a matter of whether you have access to alternative realities, to relationships that reflect a different version of who you could be, to information that contradicts the system's narrative. When the convent controls everything you see, everything you hear, all the people you interact with, when every voice that reaches you is delivering the same message, then resistance becomes not only difficult, but almost psychologically impossible. not because you are weak, but because the human mind is designed to adapt to its environment. And when the environment is totalitarian, adaptation means submission. The most disturbing thing about the conventual system is not that it existed in the past. It is that the same principles are still applicable now. They simply require adaptation to contemporary contexts. The cult that isolates its members from their families and immerses them in an environment where every message reinforces the leader's authority. The enterprise that creates a culture where questioning management decisions is career suicide. The ideological movement that treats doubt as heresy and intellectual independence as treason. The abusive relationship where the abuser slowly erodes their partner's trust in their own perception until they cannot imagine life outside the relationship. These are all descendants of the same family tree, variations on the theme of how to dismantle human autonomy and turn people into docile instruments of an alien will. The question this raises is uncomfortable, but necessary. In your own life, how much of your obedience to institutions, authorities, or systems is functional, and how much is a product of conditioning? How many times have you suppressed your own judgment, not because it was wrong, but because expressing it seemed dangerous, inconvenient, or socially unacceptable? How many of your loyalties are genuine, and how many are the result of being systematically trained to feel that autonomy is selfishness, that questioning is disloyalty, that resistance is evidence of a character flaw? Convents took these techniques to an extreme, but the underlying principles are everywhere. And the reason they remain effective is that most people never recognize when they are being applied. The most successful conditioning is the one that feels like free choice. The most complete obedience is the one experienced as authentic autonomy. If you have reached the point where you can no longer distinguish between what you truly believe and what you have been trained to believe, then the system has achieved its ultimate goal. And the only way to start undoing it is to ask yourself, if every authority you have accepted disappeared tomorrow, who would you be? And does that question free you or terrify you?